Awesome. Okay, we're going to dive right into it. So today during our steering committee meeting, we're going to give you some updates on some of the data questions people had. So either from city staff, from you all last time, or from the council. And throughout the meeting, I'm hoping we can just talk about some of these things. Some of it I found kind of shocking or interesting to think about. So would like your participation in that as well. And then I'll give a few updates on the public meeting we had a couple of weeks ago, and then talk about kind of next steps. Anna and I were just talking at the beginning of the meeting. The intention, I think, is to send you all the dashboard and the existing conditions report this week. We were going to send it prior to this meeting, but there was a bit of a staff editing process. And so we'll get that to you this week, and then you all can provide feedback as well. We're going to send it to you kind of with the watermark draft because it will be in the public domain as after we send it to you. So just know that there's more updates to come. If I can do this. All right. So as I mentioned, this is our agenda for today. So we're going to talk about some population updates. There were a lot of discussion at the public meeting with you all and with city staff about what the student population is in Clayton. You know, that's a big question. How many students live in Clayton? Also, what's this big 44% millennial population mean? Where are they living? What do they look like? Like, what are some of those other things we can learn about them? Also the crime data. So we got some interesting crime data from the police department to kind of dig in and think about how Clayton relates to other communities. We'll talk a little bit more about the business districts that I talked a little bit about last time. And then again, we'll review the public engagement. Okay, so this is and I have a few of these if anybody would like it in front of them to look at the graphs. So the how many students actually live in Clayton question is a big one. And it's sort of a moving target at all given times. So right now we're talking about students, college students. That's sort of the question here is how many people are living in Clayton because they're either living on a campus that's in Clayton or they're going to school at one of the local universities that might kind of skew your population accordingly. So you all might see a lot more people between the ages of 18 and 25 because of the presence of that. But how many more is that is sort of the big question. The students get counted by the US Census where they're living at the time. So if they're living on WashU's South 40 campus, when the census is done, that's where they're counted. So trying to kind of pull that number out is part of what we've been trying to do. Now, there's only so much you can do with the census in terms of block groups and boundaries of all those things. And so we have been trying to get to the bottom of that answer. Again, it's a moving target because students are always moving, you know, year to year, but then also if they live on campus or off campus, and if they live in, you know, we have an intern that's working with us this summer and he used to live in Clayton and he just moved to U City, you know, just from one side of WashU's campus to the other. So there's always folks moving around. But we reached out to the local campuses to see, you know, exactly how many students do you have living on your campus that falls inside the boundaries of Clayton. And these are the numbers they gave us. So WashU said about 3,000 students, which is a lot of students. And again, all those people are counted in your population estimates through the census. Fontbonne said about 135 and Concordia about 210. And so when you look at Fontbonne and Concordia, the numbers get a little bit different because they may not be 18 to 22-year-old undergraduate students. Concordia, for example, has housing for families for a married couple, and you might even have children. So it, you know, they might not necessarily fall in that age bracket, but you know, it's about as close as we can get in terms of a guess. So that gets us to 3,345 students. So then we tried to go out at a different direction and look at the US Census. And so census data cites 3,910 as the population between 18 and 24 enrolled in school in Clayton. So that's one of the questions, you know, that you can get the age and then you can ask if they're enrolled in school. However, that would count people that live in Clayton and are enrolled in school, but it may not be enrolled in school in Clayton. And so you could be a 19-year-old going to UMSL living in Clayton and still be counted in that number. I think where we got with this is that there's somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 students living in the city of Clayton. Again, it's a moving target and we're never going to get to a hard number, but I do think that's important when we think about your total population to be able to pull that number out. So thoughts about that? Mm-hmm. Pull that number out.
why do we pull that number out? Like, I would understand why we would pull maybe the Wash U number out because they don't necessarily live here full time. But anybody else?
Yeah, I don't think we would pull the number out all the time. I'm thinking we would just pull the number out when we're thinking about, you know, what's the true population of 18 to 24-year-olds that maybe are going to live in Clayton long term, or if you want to think about how it might skew racial dynamics or how it might skew some of those other demographic pieces in Clayton. Income, for example, you know, a lot of this 3,000 to 4,000 people would have essentially no income because they're full-time students. And so when you look at the average median income or average household income, it's going to be skewed quite a bit by this population. So it's just something to keep in mind to kind of understand the scale of what that group is that would begin to kind of alter those other numbers. Right.
5 are students. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
20% of the population. So therefore 1 in 5 are people who are probably not contributing anything to the tax base of Clayton other than sales tax. I mean, they're not homeowners, they're not renters, and Washington the universities don't pay taxes to the city. So.
Right.
My goodness.
It's a big chunk.
Yeah, 1 in 5 of the residents of Clayton.
Right.
So that's why you'd pull that number out. I think.
Right. And again, we're not necessarily pulling it out as if those people don't matter or anything. It's just another kind of similar to the jail population or, you know, other kind of chunks of the population. You could pull out kids, for example, in some circumstances, because they're also not contributing to the tax revenue of a city, you know, something like that. And so it's just another category of people that sometimes gets pulled out so that you can think about the demographics.
But let's take that a different direction. It was interesting looking at the documents that you shared last time because it was showing the sales tax revenue, for instance, from restaurants, which was really high, much higher than I realized. And so when I think about the student population that is ringing Clayton, what are we doing to even more draw them in?
Right.
And make them part of the community from entertainment perspective? Seems like it's ripe for the picking. So I would, you know, you've got business districts here as another topic today. Sure, they don't contribute to the tax base from a, you know, from a property perspective, but certainly from a entertainment and sales tax.
Right. And, you know, I think that population is really important too, when you think about movement, when you think about how many maybe of that segment of your population choose to stay in Clayton after they're done with school because they're familiar with the community and they love the restaurants and they think it's a great place to live, you know? So it's a unique thing from that standpoint as well, because you all are getting kind of a cycled through audience of people that are now becoming familiar with their community and maybe might choose to become homeowners down the line. Or
Well, and from a transit perspective, right, we uniquely have a couple transit stops in Clayton, right? And so part of the reason 212 got developed was to be a lower cost option for students or young professionals who could jump on the transit and head down to Wash U. So I mean, we have a lot of really built-in benefits here that I would look at that number and say, what are we doing for them versus what are they doing for us? I would target that group.
yeah. Okay. Okay, so the next big question is this millennial population. So 44%, a lot higher than the 5-county comparison geography of your population falls in this millennial group. And again, that's the, you know, late 20s, early 40s kind of group at this point. So that's not students. That's a little bit past that. You know, it could be graduate students, but it wouldn't be your traditional undergraduate. And so essentially, we're just trying to figure out what else could we find out about these people? Where do they live? What are those other demographic characteristics about this group that might help to explain why this number is so big? But then also just so we could learn more about that population.
Can you tell how many of those may have been Washington U students?
In the past, as in their graduates?
Yeah.
We could not find that out, but I wonder, that wouldn't be in the census data, for example, but I wonder if they would give us that information.
Or we do
Think
know
about that.
20%. You know, that 20% of the population, so of the 44, 20% are students. Am I doing the math right on this? So 44% of the population are millennials.
Right,
We know that 20% of the population are college students.
correct.
So therefore, if we took this college students out and we didn't have campuses here, we probably would be in line with the general pop. Or as the number of millennials.
But you were saying millennial does
Right.
not.
Correct. It
go
doesn't
with
align.
MET.
Oh, that's right.
Right.
It provides.
Exactly. So that's why I think people were kind of surprised by the millennial percentage, because it isn't caused by those students. You know, it may be caused by some of the graduate students or some of the PhD students or even the Concordia young family kind of student. Surely there's some overlap there, but it isn't the traditional undergraduate 3,000 from WashU that's sort of bumping up this number. So then the question is, what is? So you can see here that I'm going to go through a few maps that look like this, where we tried to break down the census data as granular as we could to try to learn some characteristics about them. So you can see the western part of Clayton. So again, these are the geographies that the census provides. So we have to kind of go with them in terms of understanding what we can from the data. But that green section on the western side of Clayton has the lowest percentage of householders between the ages of 25 and 44. So that's an interesting thing. I think a lot of people have a perception of the downtown resident. And East Clayton has the highest percentage. So again, that is the part that's closer to the universities. So perhaps it is those graduate students or young professors or things like that.
Which colors are the Morelands and the reddish one is the Morelands?
Yeah.
So
mhm.
really the blue section is really the Demont area, isn't it?
Correct. Mhm. And it would house the South 40 campus, Concordia
That
Fontbonne.
makes sense.
Then this looks at income. So again, we're trying to figure out of that millennial population, what can we determine about those other demographics? So in this case, millennials who live in that western section tend to have higher incomes on average than millennials that live elsewhere in the community. Conversely, millennials who live in that eastern section have lower incomes. That would be consistent with maybe that PhD student or you know, that sort of population that might be living near or on a campus. So this one's about mobility. So thinking about how often or how long people are living in Clayton, if they came from somewhere else or if they went somewhere after, you know, that sort of starts to get at that question of if Clayton is just a pass through for someone's life, you know, they're living here for a couple of years. So you can see that there's greater mobility, especially from St. Louis County and other Missouri communities in that western section. And there's greater mobility from other states in the blue section, which again, I think would support the idea of this graduate student, PhD student, something like that, living adjacent or on those campuses.
It's, yeah.
You can
Where
see
does
like
Western
the yellow section, for example, you know, 83% did not move. So 83% of folks living in this section are, you know, they've lived for several years. They're not that more transient population. 89 in this redder section.
They probably maybe purchased a condo or.
Correct. Exactly. Which is a pretty stark comparison if we're talking 83% and 89% did not move compared to 56 and 55. You know, it's a pretty dramatic difference in those middle sections of the community versus the ones on the edges.
Is it possible to see that, is there a correlation with where the multifamily housing is versus single family housing?
You know, we could, but that might be an interesting graphic to make, to think about if, you know, we can't know that for sure if that's where they're living necessarily, but we could look at the overlap of location. Yeah.
Interesting implications too, from a school district perspective, when you think about Captain versus Glenridge versus Merrimack, you know, you've got a lot of folks in the Captain area that are a lot of mobility,
Mhm.
very new.
Right. Yeah. You know, this 25 to 42 range is also like peak childbearing years. So an interesting point for the school district for sure. This next one is about race. So you can see census tract, the red section there has the highest percentage of non-white millennial residents, which I found very interesting. It is, if you recall, the section where people are least likely to move as well.
That corresponds with the dot map from the last census. Remember the dot map? Dot
Which
map
one?
was a map of the
Sorry.
United States that showed people by race. Every person was
Oh,
represented with a
yes.
dot.
Yes.
And when you looked at Clayton, it was all blue was white, except for that little
Yes.
area in the moorlands, which had Asian population.
Right.
So that's stayed from the last census. I don't know if they've done a dot map yet of this census.
Right. Yes. Well, if you do recall, Clayton had a really high percentage of Asian residents and of people speaking a different language other than English at home, significantly higher than the region.
And you
you
can
know.
see that if you walk through the moorlands.
Right. So in this case, they sort of go in the reverse order. It goes red, yellow, green, blue in terms of percentage of white residents or the non-white residents. Okay, so this one looks at home ownership. So again, we're just looking at the millennial population and thinking about percentage of home ownership. So West Clayton has the highest percentage of homeowners. And the blue or east has the lowest percentage of homeowners. In this case, homeowners, it could be a condo. But it owning versus renting is really what we're looking at here. Does this map surprise anyone?
So, I mean, I feel like a lot of the more. That's not true across the board. But I would say in the middle, especially in the category or reddish category, I mean, those
Right.
are gonna be more expensive, much more expensive homes generally across, you know?
Right,
And I think that's true in the blue too, except for obviously condos and more
Right.
multifamily housing. That's again, not true across the board, but as a general.
I think it's a little surprising you have two that are 0 under 25.
All right.
And that's all at Demond and White on Forest.
It's Demond and.
Well,
White
if
and
you look at
Forest.
the yellow area there,
Yeah.
which would include White on Forest. That area is probably the most affordable. 0 for both of those
Other than
areas,
Clay,
that's a little surprising.
is Clayshire up in the green section?
Yes.
It is.
Yep. in the
So
bottom.
Left corner.
Yeah. But that, I mean, that kind of goes with, I mean, there was an article in the New York Times about.
right.
Right.
It was like in the last couple of days and I mean. No, I mean, still it would have been hard to buy a home when you're under 25, 20 years ago, but now, at least based on that,
Right.
it's hard for people to buy.
I actually think it's interesting that in the green section, there's 33% under 25. That seems like a pretty high percentage of
The condos are a factor there.
totally. I think absolutely. But that still speaks to people being able to purchase something here in the community, whether it be a condo or a single family home.
Yep.
Especially because purchasing something provides access to the school district, for example, and some of the other amenities in Clayton that, you know, a single family home would also let you do, but a condo at a cheaper price.
There's not, but there's even so, there's not a lot of condos available. I mean, it's a lot of apartments, but there's
Mhm.
not a ton of, you know, comparatively to just.
In which area are you talking about?
In
How do I
green, I mean, there are condos, but it's not, you know, I would say it's. And,
All of those on Brentwood though. There's a lot of,
Right.
and those are inexpensive.
but those aren't
condos.
all condos though. It's just that one Park Tower and then the one that's more retirement living. And Shaw Park, which is closer to.
Thinking of those ones across from the.
Those are condos.
Yeah,
Those are all
condos.
condos,
That's
and there's
right.
a
You're
lot of
right.
them,
There's,
and they're
yeah,
cheap.
those are all condos.
Is there anything, so this is my last map about the millennial population. Is there anything else about the millennial population that you're thinking like, man, I really wish we knew this thing about that group?
So is it fair to say that the millennials that live in Clayton for the most part, if they own property, they're making a lot of money. I mean, or just period, if you're living in apartments in downtown Clayton,
Mhm.
you're not working at a car wash.
I think comparatively, like no one who lives in Clayton
Right.
is not making a lot of money unless you're a student.
I think that's a general statement, not just millennial oriented.
Right.
Yeah.
But I do think that shows up in the area you're talking,
Right.
Ward 3 or the western part. If you look back
Yeah.
at that household income map and then you compare that to home ownership. 100,000 plus, you can see it's at 78%. And when you flip to home ownership, it's higher than the other areas. There's a correlation there.
Right.
There's also a correlation with the 18% are earning less than 25,000 in the blue. So they're not buying houses. It makes
Right.
sense.
They're
No.
students.
Right.
No.
Right.
Right, they are probably that student population that is not an undergraduate student, you know, 'cause to fall into this, they're 25 or older, but they could be that PhD student or, you know, some other kind of student that just has a work study job or a research job that's making that really low wage. And also may not be interested in buying anything because they're here temporarily anyway.
And, you know, we don't have affordable housing in Clayton. So if they're making under $10,000, they're getting money from somewhere, maybe not salary,
Right.
mom and dad or.
And, you know, they could be living off a stipend or something like that if they're a research student or something like that at the university. So that would be a factor as well, because it wouldn't necessarily be income.
Yeah.
Okay. The next big category of things people had a lot of questions about is crime. Thinking about how crime relates to nearby communities, thinking about you know, obviously when crime happens in your community, it feels like a really big deal, but sort of trying to put some context to that to think about what kind of crime happens here, how that compares to other communities. So we received a bunch of data from the Clayton Police Department, which was really helpful, to think about what kind of crimes are happening here, where they're happening, and then again, how that relates to other communities. So you can see there, the Clayton Police Department, that's the very top line on this graph, the very top category. You all are significantly lower than some communities. Just overall crime, you're a little bit higher than say Ladue or Webster. But a lot of that from your crime falls into what they count as government or public buildings, which is crimes happening at the jail. So if you, and you know, similarly, Richmond Heights and Brentwood have a lot more crimes happening at commercial buildings like the mall. Right. So then if you, this is a lot to look at, but basically we tried to pull it out by location to determine, okay, if you really pulled out those crimes that happen at the jail, what does that mean for the rest of crime in Clayton? And so that top right graph is crimes that happen at government buildings. And so you can see you all far outpace your peers, but that is really just because of the presence of the jail here versus, you know, another community that may not have that. For all of the other categories of things, so commercial buildings, residences or homes, and then roads, parking lots, et cetera, you all are at the bottom of the pack. And so I think what this data all tells us is what I think community members get the sense of. Crime is really not very bad here. When you look at it as a whole and you throw in that crime that happens at the jail, it skews the numbers quite a bit. And so what we wanted to do is pull that out and see what the numbers really say. Anything about this shocking?
The Brentwood and Richmond Heights ones just really jumped off the page.
Right.
I mean, I get the fact that Galleria is right there, but still, I mean, Richmond Heights, I'm really surprised. I mean, yeah, they have a lot of commercial corridors. I don't know, so do we.
So the Galleria is in Richmond Heights, so that one is probably accounting for almost all of that. Brentwood doesn't have a mall, but they've got all that other commercial space.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. Where the Target and all that is, that's all Brentwood.
Yeah, because even like shoplifting and stuff's gonna show up here.
I
and they
guess
have a
so,
lot of
yeah.
Opportunities for those types of crimes.
Totally.
Our theft is automobiles more than anything else.
Right. Yeah. So, that is one advantage. A lot of comments we heard about not having a lot of retail space in Clayton. It's something to keep in mind. With a certain kind of retail space in particular comes some other things in your community. And clearly that having a big presence of commercial space has resulted in quite a lot of police interaction in those communities. So something to keep in mind. Okay, so the next big category of things is business districts. So you all have seen this map before, but we worked with the city to kind of define what these business districts are in Clayton, the boundaries of which are not overly important, except for that we needed to be able to group them so that we could analyze them differently. The character of some of these are very different than others. So this is what we'll be referencing when we talk about some of this data.
Can we go back for a quick sec?
Absolutely.
On the,
No, it's hard to see.
oh, good Lord,
The one in front of you.
on the gateway, the Brentwood Gateway.
Yes.
Shouldn't that also cover the eastern side of Brentwood? Because there are some small commercial stores, dry cleaner, a medical supply. Those are commercial buildings that, while they may not be ones that people generally walk up to today, they could be repurposed to other uses in the future. Everybody talks about an ice cream store. Well, you could put an ice cream store in there. So, there is some commercial on the eastern side.
Also cleaners.
Oh, did we?
They're gone.
Really? I didn't know that.
Closed for about a year.
Wow. Well, I missed that. Well, there you go. There's an empty storefront that
There
needs
you go.
somebody.
Well, interestingly, the Brentwood Gateway is the one place we couldn't get a lot of data. So you'll see here, this is an overview of just what your inventory is in terms of square footage in each of these different business districts. So you can see the breakdown of office, retail, and hospitality space, and then the total square footage of each. So they range quite a bit. Demond, for example, has very little inventory just because it's a lot of small storefronts, and you just don't get the kind of inventory you get in, for example, the central business district, which accounts for more than 50% of your space in total in the community. 87% of space is office space, so that's quite a bit. It's not terribly shocking given you think about office space goes up, so it takes up less space. And about 3% of space is retail space.
Sorry.
White on Gateway, I'm surprised has so much space, because from the map, it looks like it's just like from Hanley to Glen Ridge, right? On Whiteown, there's just the,
It punches above its weight, really.
Right.
So does Demond. Because a couple I've cheated and looked ahead, and how Demond has really regained all its foot traffic.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like, these are really, really important islands of commercial. When we talk about, I looked ahead at the comments, people like,
You really cheated.
I did cheat.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
But people saying that they want to be able to walk to commercial.
Mhm.
These are really important islands for them to be able to walk to.
Right.
I think tied to that is an understanding of when there's a mixed use of residential and commercial versus just commercial. Because that's part of the walkability, is part of the scale, the fabric, the quality, all of that plays into those.
Absolutely.
that's why we need to fill that empty Starbucks space.
So here you did look ahead. So part of what we did is a visitation analysis to understand how many people are really moving through these business districts every day. So, we've talked a lot about how Clayton sees really high lease rates for a lot of the spaces, but that doesn't necessarily translate to a lot of people, especially in the office space environment. The spaces may be fully leased, but they might be on a 3 days at the office, 2 days work from home schedule. And so it means you're getting 20% less people all the time. And that has implications for things like retail and who's going to go out to lunch and all those questions. So we looked at visitation from January 2017 through June of 2023. So we can see exactly how many people moved through all these business districts for each month in that time frame. And what this chart shows you is the average monthly visitation for each business district. And then what was the highest month? What was that peak visitation? So in that spread from 2017 to essentially now, what month saw the most people in each business district? And then what is today's visitation, so June 2023, as a percentage of that peak? So essentially, how far are we from the peak? Are we close to being back at that? Interestingly, Clayton East and Des Moines, their peaks were in 2022, so post-pandemic, versus all of the other business districts saw the peak or the highest visitation pre-pandemic. So that's one interesting kind of dynamic. And then also the Clayton East and Des Moines areas both are closest to that peak. You know, today they're seeing a particularly Des Moines, almost 100% of that. So an interesting thing, you know, you can think about from what's unique about Clayton East and Des Moines as it compares to the other ones. You know, there's some built environment pieces. There's also, you know, other components to what people, maybe what lifestyle is like post-pandemic to think about that might play into these numbers. So what do you all think about this?
Well, that's Clayton East. That's where that new walk-in medical urgent care is. Right at the corner of Big Bend and Clayton Road.
Right.
That's actually on the Richmond Heights side.
Oh, yeah, that's on the other side of the street. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's the occupancy rate more than anything that's driving that. There aren't many vacant spaces over in these areas.
Yeah, like the Walgreens is gonna, has always done well.
Just like you
Right.
mentioned Starbucks a minute ago, if you look at the Whiteout Gateway there, like that that used to drive a lot of trips in that
Yeah.
particular area. So when that space goes down, you're gonna see that number drop with it.
Right. And well, now that Wright's Tavern is back,
Hmm.
you know, that was a big, I mean, all those Zoe restaurants that were empty for a long time, they're now all
It'll start
filled
to
again.
run back up, but
Right.
as long as
Yeah.
that Starbucks space is empty, that number is gonna be lower. And even if something goes in that doesn't drive that kind of traffic, that number is always gonna be lower.
Well, and I think too, what's interesting to me is looking at like Clayton East, even Clayton West. I mean, we treat, you know, we're kind of, I think it would be really important from a business district to also think about regionalism, because those commercial corridors don't live in isolation. Like there's a moat on
Right.
Clayton Road. You know, I
Yeah.
mean, there is a Schnucks that's across the street, you know, there is Esquire across the street. You know, there's I can't think of the Italian pasta place down by, there's High Point, you know, theater.
Right.
All of those are part of what draws people to both sides of the street. So I do think it's really important for us to bridge beyond our borders a little bit, especially when we think about business, to think about how do those work together? Because it's going to be fruitless for us to say we only care about our side of the street.
Right.
Very good point. Thank you.
I also wonder for the Clayton East, so that includes WashU's South 40 or South Campus, the old CBC site.
Mhm.
And I just noticing like the peak of Clayton East was September of 22. So that would be a time where likely WashU
Student.
students are using those facilities.
Right.
So having us still be 78% in a June month, which is when WashU is likely not really using
Right.
that whole section, that's pretty good.
That is pretty good. You know, that's another thing we have started doing is thinking about what occurred in the peak month. You know, for example, like the art fair occurring downtown might skew a month versus, you know, and so thinking about what occurred in these peak months, you know, like when Louis opened, does that draw a bunch of people at the Des Moines area? You know, it's a small area, but one restaurant could have a pretty big impact because it's so small. So thinking about what are those things that maybe change the trajectory of some of these, I think would be an interesting piece as well. Right?
Absolutely.
Once ice cream parlor.
Well, there's no question about the art fair based upon
Right.
the projections of attendance have been in the 125 to 130,000 over the period of noon on Friday through 5 o'clock on Sunday.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know. So, but that top number, the 942,000 in the CBD, so that's
Yeah.
basically, and then the average 626. That's kind of saying, if you were to divide that by 30, that's about how many people come in On average.
If, right,
But,
there's
I
a
mean,
lot of
It's obviously,
week-
it's gonna be a lot
right.
lower. It's gonna skew basically during the week or on the
Totally.
weekends.
which
but-
is data we also have. It's just not up here. To see which day is busiest, thinking about as a weekend, as a weekday, even time of day, to think about.
That is like data you'll have.
Absolutely, yes, yes. And I think, when we're planning for some of the vacancies in some of these places, I think that's gonna be super important. Whether you're trying to get people to come more days of the week or more times of the day, or you're trying to build on the time when everybody's there, so we need another restaurant or we need another something that can cater to that audience that's already there.
And also just like fluctuations and obviously pre and post pan. Office vacancies and how that would
Totally.
compare.
Mhm.
And don't forget about construction traffic either,
Right.
driving numbers. So Centene's under construction in October of 18. Doing a bunch of tenant finishes and everything. Pop up.
It wasn't Shakespeare in the Streets then.
Okay, I'm gonna move us to public engagement. So there was an open house a couple of weeks ago. I saw many of you there. Thank you for coming. We were trying to estimate based on sign-in sheets and number of people that participated, and we think it was like between 60 and 70 attendees. It was mostly older, long-term residents of the city who own their homes. Mix of single family and condo dwellers, so across the city in terms of geography. One of the things we asked people was to vote on priorities. So they were given 12 or 15 different priorities that people might have for their community, spanning from green space to housing to community character, all those kinds of things. So you can see here that these 4 were the ones that received the highest votes. So we asked people what they cared about most in the community, what were their priorities for planning for the future. So that we got this: pedestrian and bike friendly streets, affordable small business and retail space, housing options affordable across a range of incomes, and then improved parks and green space. This is a lot of text, but I kind of wanted to put a few answers as written for you, because we asked people, what is your 20-year vision for Clayton? So a comprehensive plan is typically looking 10 or 20 years down the line. So we asked people to think about what would they like the community to look like in 20 years? And this is what they said.
Curious for the folks at PGVA. No, how do you guys say your names?
Maybe it's. okay.
PGVA.
It
I
is.
got,
I know. It's better than the last names. For a while, they went by the last name.
Is there anything about these comments that surprised you? Is there anything that stands out?
I think a lot of it is answers you get in many communities. I think some people were, things like low rise, 3 to 4 story condos, like those kinds of things are more specific to a community like Clayton that has more mixed housing options in terms of housing style. In some communities there, it's almost exclusively single family and they don't have the kind of presence of a downtown like you all have. So I think that's a unique piece of Clayton. The sustainability piece I know is a focus for the city and for residents that choose to live here. So I think that's another piece that's a little bit more unique to Clayton.
I think condo comment is kind of interesting because I guess people's perception is that if you buy a condo, you're somehow more invested in the community, not gonna move, right?
Right.
So, but the problem right now, from the standpoint of the city, is that, developers are coming to us with apartments because the condo market has bottomed out. So
Right.
it's not really feasible for developers right now. So it's interesting, but I think there's a lot of people that live in apartments for long periods. So it's interesting, the perception.
Right.
of Condos versus apartments, but, I don't know. A perception that people who live, they don't want to deal with selling something later on.
Right.
That's in his early 70s and lives down by. Anything, so he rents. So, but.
Right.
I don't know. It's just. people said more condos.
Well, I think we've had a challenge also in, not just because of the developers, but look at what happened at the corner of Wydown and Hanley, where there was that proposal to build on an empty parking lot, and it got shot down. There were a lot of people who were against it.
A lot of stuff beyond empty parking lot. That was an issue with that development, though.
There was, but there's, a.
Really crap.
I disagree. I didn't think it was crappy, but I mean, that's the challenge I think we're gonna have is there's just a lot, there's, where is this magical space gonna show up where it's like everybody's all on board with it? You know, it's never that way. So it's, I think we're just challenged in doing what people are asking for. I think it's just a
Right.
challenge.
Which is not a unique thing to Clayton.
Right.
The fact that people request things that they then, once they see it, they're like, I'm not sure about that. That's a very standard thing that occurs.
I think people just want to, I mean, these comments obviously show people want to be able to walk to retail.
Yeah.
There, obviously the city has, you know, we required to put retail at at our street levels when we built. But I think people on the board struggle because retail is, you know, obviously very expensive here and it's hard to get the local bookstore. So it's also, but we also don't want to see empty storefronts. So obviously you walk up and down Forsyth, Centene still has open space and for a long time. Or the open space that's at the bottom of the Clarendelle, you know, like it's hard to get retail. So it's like a little bit of a struggle, you know, to kind of figure out finding a balance, but obviously understanding that our residents.
Right.
Wonder how different this would be than the neighboring counties around us saying these would be the same things they want to. It's kind of what you want in a close inner ring suburb.
Right.
Right.
So I don't, you know. You know what, I want a fresher environment, easier streets, but then. Go for walks.
It's exactly what I was kind of asking. Is there really anything different than what you see in other communities with this list? It feels pretty consistent with what most people who live in these inner ring suburbs would be looking for.
Right. I think with the exception of your downtown area, you know, I think the Demond district is similar to downtown Maplewood from that standpoint that people are living in single family homes, but walkable to some kind of business district. And so I think that is pretty similar. I think the presence of your downtown is very different and not really applicable to many nearby communities.
Yeah, our downtown versus Webster's downtown,
Right.
for example. Yeah,
Right.
we should have all those cute stores they have in Webster, but
The downtown is definitely very different and, you know, thinking about the time of day that people are visiting, you know, downtown Clayton is really heavy daytime environment because you have so much office versus downtown Webster. It doesn't have that much daytime visitation, but they make up for it with the nighttime visitation. So, you know, just thinking about what makes downtown Clayton unique is part of what I think the conversation is going to be in order to try to fill some of that retail space.
I just.
This is just some other comments that I pulled out from some of the things people told us. So what's working well, you know, a lot of people mentioned the schools, that it's safe, that it's walkable in many areas, that it feels like a community. There's a good sense of community in Clayton, and then great parks, lots of comments about the parks and amenities related to that. We also asked people to respond to some of the data. So did any of those things surprise you? Any of those things, stuff you didn't know or that you wouldn't have thought? So how little green space you have came up several times. So by percentage of land use, if you recall, it was a pretty low percentage. It's actually pretty standard to most communities. And that map that shows walking distance to green space reveals that essentially everyone living in Clayton is within 5 or 10 minutes of a green space, which is great. Many of them are small green spaces though. And so when you think about land use, it just doesn't represent that big of a percentage, which in my mind speaks to the sort of irrelevance of that percentage because people do have access. It's just to different kinds of green spaces. How much of the city is single family? So from a land use perspective, you know, you all have a lot of your land covered in single family homes, but that's really just because they're on larger lots. When you look at the breakdown of single family to multifamily and owner to renter, it's much more mixed. But from a land use percentage, it's more striking. that millennials are the largest age group. So this is one of those things that tons of people commented on. They just didn't expect that to be the case and wanted to learn more about why that was and what else can we know about them. And then lastly, that so few residents work in Clayton. So if you recall, we looked at how many people live in Clayton, how many people work in Clayton, and then what that overlap is, and it's very small. To me, it's not terribly shocking because you have so many people coming into the community every day for work. You know, that number's never going to be, it far exceeds the number of residents you have. But I think people were pretty shocked by how many residents go elsewhere for work, that it isn't maybe a driver for people to live in Clayton because they also work here. Some recommended changes people mentioned quite a few times. You know, some people had some really specific recommended changes related to pedestrian improvements, that encouraging street level activity, and then a lot of comments on historic architecture. So whether that was how to protect it, or if we could inventory it, or what it means and how could we kind of quantify it. A lot of questions about that. And here's some more of those questions that we received either in conversation or on the papers that notes people left. What role does historic preservation play? So again, is that a reason people are deciding to live in Clayton? Does that help some of those numbers around visitation and some of those places that saw a higher percentage of visitation? Are those places that are more historic? What does that mean? What can be done to lower the rental cost per square foot to attract some of those small businesses? I think people notice that the costs are high here and that might be a barrier to those small businesses. So is there a way to kind of fill that gap? How do the schools relate here? So we've got a meeting later today to talk a little bit more about what school data we can have access to, because we know the schools are really good, but a lot of questions around where students are living and how that relates to if they decide to live in Clayton. How can we increase the percent of people who both live and work in Clayton? And then what are we going to do about the soft office and hotel market in the long term? So if we're thinking that 10 or 20 years down the line, what does it mean for those uses moving forward? You know, thinking about if your lease rates are high now, what's it going to look like when leases are up? Are people going to change their mind about how much space they need, given they might be in the 2 or 3 days in-person work environment? Same thing with hotels, you know, have we gone too far? A lot of questions around that. So making sure we're figuring out what that looks like moving forward, even if it looks okay now, what could it look like in the future? Okay. That's what I've got for you all. We've got 6 minutes left. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts?
What?
Sorry, go ahead.
I think you've done a great job slicing and dicing this data out, and thank you for that, because
Of course.
that's a lot. That's a lot of stuff to go through. That was amazing. Thank you.
But it's a lot of different data, and I think there's a lot of things that make Clayton unique that sort of need a little bit more of a deep dive than maybe the overarching data. So we appreciate your feedback throughout, so we could make sure to get further into some of these pieces.
I guess I know, will we kind of continue to evaluate, you know, we've got like a table at the back
Yes.
this week, but will we continue to evaluate throughout the process? So if like we get to November and we still find that we are traffic or something, but I mean, just to make sure we're kind of
Yes.
Yeah.
So after the presentation at the Board of Aldermen last week or the week before, we have decided that we're gonna, Jessica's working on it, kind of if Clayton was 100 people, what would it be? Sort of breakdown, so that we can ensure throughout the process that the people we have engaged match that kind of profile of what Clayton is, so that then, yes, we can kind of correct our approach throughout and do another pop-up at a park or do another engagement with a certain demographic, so that we can try to make sure. Because I think truly it's more important than the number that we engage, is that then whoever we do engage is consistent with who lives here. So that's sort of the approach we've decided based on that conversation with the board.
For the next steering committee meeting, what do you think we'll be covering?
So the next steering committee meeting will be kind of focused more on that scenario planning sort of stage. So we're getting to the end of the existing conditions phase of this process. It's something that kind of goes on throughout. So as you all continue to ask questions about, I wonder what this means, and I wonder what this could look like in Clayton versus another community, we'll still be diving into the data until we finish this process. So keep those thoughts coming. However, we will begin to move away from pure data collection and into the scenario planning phase. And so what that is going to look like here in Clayton is less of a, you have a big plot of land that needs to be thought of, because you don't have that. You don't have a big plot of land ready to be developed. But some areas in your community that might be susceptible to change or might be turning over from a land use standpoint, or a type of use that you'd like to see more in the community. And so what we have built a 3D twin of the community. So a 3D map version of Clayton, so that we can kind of pluck down some other land uses and see both from a physical standpoint, what does it look like, but also, what are the revenue impacts? What are the population impacts? What it might do to the school district from a sustainability standpoint, all of that. And so that will be work that will come back to you a few times to kind of refine what those scenarios look like. And then ultimately the scenarios kind of get built into the future land use map, which gets included in the final comprehensive plan, a future land use map of what you'd like the community to look like. So that will kind of be the subject of the next meeting with you all, is thinking about those areas, thinking about what those physical land use changes could look like. And then we'll come back to you a couple more times. That's also what the public meeting in December will be more focused on, is that land use aspect.
In the previous meeting. Alex, did you have something you were going to say?
No, I was going to say that's great. I really appreciate the attempt to engage the community in different ways. And I really respect the meeting we just had at the center. I thought that was a great one for people to come. I'm sorry that we didn't have, 200 people, but the value for those who were there, I got very positive comments.
Great.
I'm wondering if it's in the last meeting, you had some stats that compared us to some other cities around the country. I'm wondering if it would be a valuable exercise to have some type of ongoing reference points, whether these are cities that are most like us, size, having their own downtown. As you pointed out, we're really not like any other suburb in St. Louis. So I think it might be instructional and insightful to say what we're actually more like is Midtown Atlanta, or Buckhead, or Carmel, Indiana, and start kind of thinking a little more broadly about what is it that's making those cities successful, thriving, growing. Maybe they have more of what we want, more active retail, more walkability, more green space. Maybe they figured out things that we want to become.
Right.
And I think it would be helpful for the community to start even thinking that way. Like, it's really not us against Ladue or Richmond Heights. It's how do we compare to Buckhead,
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Tyson's Corner, Virginia, whatever.
Right. We've talked a little bit in the office about Evanston as a, north of Chicago. They've got Northwestern, but they also have sort of a downtown. And so thinking about others. So if others come to mind for you all in the next month or so, send those our way for sure. But I think that's a great idea, especially from both sort of a feel and character standpoint, but also from a land use perspective. What is their land use mix? Is it similar to what you all have in your CBD, for example? Is it very different? And how did they get there? Maybe. I think that's a great
Yeah, I'd
idea.
love to be able to say, hey, these are the sort of people who go to Boulder, go to
Mhm.
Evanston.
Right.
We actually want them to come here. And people say, well, that's never going to happen. It's like, why not? I mean, why not? Why shouldn't this be on their radar?
Right.
One
I
other
agree.
thing that I think complicates this process is the whole world is discovering how we come out of pandemic.
Mhm. Yeah.
So nobody's got some future map that they know. And along that line, and how many people do end up going back to work? Zoom is making their employees come back to work a couple days a week. Hello. So how's that going to
Well,
shake out? Do we know what
I
the
think this
average,
trend- I'm sorry, go ahead. Pardon me.
do we know what the average commercial lease term is? I.e., a lot of people still have their leases because they were
right.
pre-fit. Do we know what that average is? Like, is it 5 years, 10 years? So that
Oh,
we
I
can
see
say,
what you
okay,
mean. You could
people have
project
re-upped
it.
their leases.
Right.
at this point, and so it is what it's gonna be. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So if, so if I worked at, Centene, and now I have only half of my people coming in half the time, am I gonna keep all that space when it comes up? Or
Oh.
am I going to
Oh.
get rid of it?
We
Well,
know-
forget Centene, pick somebody else. If I'm Worldwide Technologies and I've
Right.
got a tech company and, you know, how many people are
Right.
coming back and for how long? So I happen to know they gave up a lot of their office space because their leases were up downtown. They gave up their east campuses and whatnot. Because their lease came up, people are only coming back so many days. So if we knew kind of what is the horizon of the average commercial lease term? So is it 3 years, 5 years? So we'd know when the turnover would be, because we can't look to another community to know that now, because we're all in the,
Then we're gonna potentially bottom out.
yeah, we're all in the same boat, and we're just, how people are gonna pivot is gonna be interesting, right? Because we insisted on having all this retail and it's just sitting empty. Mixed use was the thing, it must be, and now we see, well, how'd that work out? Not so well.
So then we should be looking at a plan B or a
Yeah.
plan C alternatives that may or may not materialize.
Yeah, that repurposing, as you mentioned earlier, repurposing some of that office space for other uses. So we know that spaces like apartments are now really fighting it out to have the most amenities,
Right.
right? So that they took that dentist office and now that's going to be the space where people will gather who live in the cool apartments behind, but they'll have this vintage old building to come and, you know, have coffee with their friends. Everybody, you know, our movie screening room or all the things people want now. So what will office space, and there was a big article in the Business Journal, I'm sure you all saw about Clayton's office space. So Class A is got a lot more amenities. You know, we need to have a gym, we need to have showers. So what is going to come out of that? And when is that lease turnover? And how will we know when we've experienced what's
Right. Yeah, I also think identifying those Class B and Class C office spaces might help us in that scenario planning exercise to think about what maybe are those changes of use. Because your Class A office space has continued to perform very well. As soon as it vacates
Right.
by some tenant, it is filled again by another tenant. You just have a unique office environment that's much more attractive than essentially any other office environment in the region. And so the A space is likely to continue to be attractive, given that it is sort of the most attractive in a large geography, but the B and C space, you know, what are those, where are the concentrations of it? And then what are those other uses that, given the turnover, maybe will be needed?
as
This is-
A gets fancier, some
Right.
Bs are going to be Cs.
That's true, yeah.
You know, that's the
Mhm.
other reality.
Well, and again, I think this is where it's really critical for us to think regionally. Because so a lot of different firms are leaving downtown St. Louis, like law firms, right? Because they want the Class A space and there's an abundance of it here, right? Which could end up being just fine for downtown St. Louis because they have a lot of older buildings which can be repurposed into apartments and make downtown more of a neighborhood where people live, play, do other things. We don't have historic buildings here, nor will we ever. I mean, we're building a bunch of glass towers that 30 or 50 years from now will be glass towers. And they're not going to be historic, but that's okay. It's like, if regionally, this community can fill the super new, super Class A office needs for firms and other regions like Webster's not going to be Clayton. Let Webster be the cute little downtown. That's not where we went. That's okay, right? Not you. But this is again where I think thinking of this regionally is really, really important.
Good. And I don't think that we should not include in our thinking that there'll be more change in our downtown area as it relates to some buildings that will be coming down. Just as it's occurred in some of our neighborhoods with the tear downs and the reconstruction of residential units. As I drive in the downtown area, there are some buildings that just, I can't imagine them being around long term.
I wonder about like, are you guys gonna establish a set of goals, particular goals that come out of what the residents are saying, or is it? Because I think a lot of this has to do with what are we trying to achieve? And if we're trying to make sure there's leases and offices versus other things. So just like, what's the measure, I guess, is an interesting question that we could ask. I also think the boundaries are super important, as have been mentioned, because we're such a small municipality, like the whole living and working in Clayton, I'm looking at WashU just across the border, like so many people, at least in Des Moines, work there, I'm sure. And, so how do we kind of like redraw this with the fuzzy boundaries? Because Forest Park is also such an amenity and clearly accessible to a lot of people in Clayton. And so how do we just like the south side of Clayton Road? So I think that's part of the draw of Clayton, is that we have these great edges that actually expand what we have in Clayton. So like, how do we kind of count it without counting it, I think is really important. But the thing I wanted to say also is about broader sustainability goals, the environment. Like we have a good picture of the retail health or not health or retail goals, but like, what is the environmental health, or I don't know, like flooding is increasing. Is that a factor in Clayton itself? Or how does I think the Wydown corridor probably plays a huge role in terms of like animal movement from Forest Park, Shaw Park, bike connectivity between the parks. So I think that would be super interesting to understand in terms of the goals. Like, should we be leveraging this process to possibly think about how to incentivize those Metrolink stops, or how to really help people who live nearby and would go by bike, actually go by bike? And how would that, offset emissions and tree canopy, and just all of those broader things are not going to go away. And I think we need to know where we're at to know what the goals might be. Like even spending money on making all this concrete more impermeable would go a long way for absorbing water, getting it back in the water table, all of that.
So
I was just gonna say, a lot of that data is in the existing conditions report and the dashboard in terms of tree canopy coverage and pavement coverage and emissions and trips on bike versus car and all that stuff. And so I'm hopeful that you all will kind of look at that and keep that in the back of your mind, so that when we do the land use scenario planning process, you can think about, option number 1 is going to add this much more pavement versus option number 2, which is going to add this many more residents versus, you know what I mean? Because I think determining what the priorities are in the community is going to be sort of informed by what metric you think is most important. And that's going to be different for everybody. And so figuring out kind of how that balance is going to work so that you can determine what is the way forward, I think is going to be key.
only going to add that I represent the Sustainability Advisory Committee. And we've been spending a lot of time thinking about, what is our North Star about what sustainability means for Clayton. And we kind of agreed that really what we're trying to do is reduce our carbon footprint. That's like the most important thing we can do right now in terms of greenhouse gases and climate change. And so a lot of that's driven by buildings. If you look at what's really causing our carbon footprint here, it's buildings. So how do we attack that first? There are a lot of sustainability needs, but we definitely are trying to think of it that way. And I know you guys are doing some benchmarking for us, so we could say, here's where we are from a carbon footprint perspective. And then we could say, now that we know where we are, what would it take to reduce it? Because we actually do have a goal in Clayton to reduce our carbon footprint by, I think it's 30% by 2030 and 50% by 2050. I mean, those have been stated. How do we get there?
And so if those goals exist, for example, do we want to still support the building of new condos because that's what people have asked for and that will add new residents, which adds new revenue? But if we're going to do that, we've also got to incentivize Metrolink use, or, what's the other piece of it? And so there's not going to be, reducing your carbon footprint is not the only priority for Clayton. And so, and it's also not going to be a priority for some people, but it's going to be the most important priority for others. And so figuring out kind of what those levers are to accomplish both that and some of those other things that people care about, I think is the kind of policy game you're going to have to play here of what policies and incentives can you put into place to help accomplish some of those goals, but then also get some of those other things.
There are examples of other cities, actually a town in Kansas that's completely green, that where all the public buildings, everybody decided to, I mean, they were wiped out by a tornado. They
Right.
rebuilt
Had to.
from scratch. But interestingly, they said, you know, the wind took us down, we need to channel the wind, and they voted to be green, and they're green. I mean, it's the public building, so it's not the private, you know, how do you incentivize new housing to have alternate energy? I think that's a really important question. It seems like a no-brainer. Design the roof to accept solar panels. It's like, why would you not at this point? But I don't know, that those kinds of things, can they be in a comprehensive plan? Maybe they're not relevant to a comprehensive plan. I don't know.
I think absolutely. I mean, recommendations around building homes that would accommodate solar panels could certainly be a recommendation. You know, I think there'd be other people that would think that that might ruin the look of your historic neighborhood. You know, and so it's balancing all those things that, you know, if a community determines that's not going to work, then what are the other ways that we could get to the goal of reducing carbon emissions?
Cool.
Sorry, we've gone over time. Yeah, exactly. Well, you know how to get to a hold of Anna at least, and if not, then me, but feel free to continue sending your thoughts. And again, if you see other cities or other policies, send them our way.
Great, thank you.
Oh, yes, that's right. On the website.
You're gonna send us the link to this?
Yes, well,
dashboard
Anna
thing,
will, but
or do we
yes.
have it? We don't have it.
No,
Okay.
no, we'll send that out. We were going through like a staff review first
Yeah.
of some of it, and then we'll send it out by the end of the week.
Awesome. And then Anna will work with you all to schedule the next meeting, which is in October.
Great,
Awesome. Thank you.
thank you. Appreciate it. Be safe, everybody.
Thanks. Should I end this? Okay.
One thing Kansas has going forward is a much better political environment.